Hi guys, welcome back to Chess the Matthew. So on this video, we will tackle about a tricky young Magnus Carlsen, in which he plays against Jan Ludvig Hammer on 2003 from his youth World Championship chess tournament under 14. So here, Hammer plays knight f3 on the first move, and Magnus Carlsen here reply with the move d6, in which they actually goes for an opening of reti, and later on, for example, after Hammer plays d4, knight f6, knight b to d2, and after g6, it seems like the opening goes for a transposition to the perk defense. After, for example, Hammer plays e4 and Magnus Carlsen play the move bishop g7. So here we shall see that position on the board was actually resembled to a perk defense. For example, if the black here will play c5 with pawn structures of 2 phalanx pawn and a c5 and d6. But here, Hammer plays the move bishop d3, trying to vacate the square so that the white now can castle. And here Magnus Carlsen castle first on the king side, and after Hammer here plays do the same after castling. Magnus Carlsen here now play the move knight to c6, in which he do not choose the perk style on this position by playing knight c6. Because for example, on this position, if Magnus Carlsen here plays c5, then we shall go to an opening of perk defense. But for example, after c3, c6 d4, c6 d4, e5, and after the white here plays d5, in which it results to a fixed center and a close one that actually lead to a draw. Here Magnus Carlsen, young tricky Magnus Carlsen on this position, play knight c6 and plays aggressively by just developing his piece on the board, for example, and attacking the center. And here Hammer plays c3. He tries to boost the center first with c3 control, and Magnus Carlsen here play the move d5 to put attention on the center, and actually on this position it resembles now to a King's Indian setup against the white in this position. For example, with the knight here, for example, after the knight will be moved here and there is a f5, for example, and tries to pressure the king side of white here with f5, f4, for example. And here, after Magnus Carlsen play e5, Hammer here just play a passive move after h3, trying to stop any knight hop or even bishop to g4 on this position. But it allows here for Magnus Carlsen to play knight h5 and do his King's Indian stuff, for example, after playing f5 and f4, and even to push g5 to g4 to attack the white's king on this position. And here, the white here plays d6 e5, try to fix now the center and try to release the tension. But Magnus Carlsen here play an in-between move after knight f4, attacking first the bishop, because for example, after the white here plays bishop to b5, here now Magnus Carlsen captured the e5 pawn. And on this position, the knight takes e5 here for the white, allows here for Magnus Carlsen to play queen to g5. Because after on this position, the white here is actually not obliged to take back with the knight on e5, but instead to play the move a4. It's like we're opening, in which there is an a4, but the only difference is the white plays a4 on the first move. And the idea of a4 here is to have a queenside expansion, and with defense on this bishop, for example, just a random move, if for example after g6, knight takes, and queen to g5 with a threatening to mate in 1, but there's just a simple knight to g4, and whatever the black here capture the knight, but after h takes g4, there is no queen takes b5 because there is a pawn that actually defend the bishop. Unlike, for example, on the text move, after knight takes e5 here in this position, that there is no a4 defense of the bishop, the white here plays queen to g5 that attacks both the knight and the bishop on this position. So going back, for example, after an alternative move, after a4, a6, for example, for black, and for example, after bishop c4, a retreat, and queen to f6 for black, the white here can simply play rook to e1, for example, because after knight e to d3, there is just a simple rook e3, and after knight takes c1, and rook takes c1 on this position, even though the white here has a pair of bishop, but the white pieces on this position is actually an active square that actually already been developed on this position. So going back on this position, after hammer here just play knight takes e5, that actually gives a +1 for the black on this position, because there is a queen to g5 for black that actually attacks both the pieces of the white on e5 and b5 with a threatening mate in 1 on g2. Hammer here plays knight to g5 to defend the checkmate against these pieces of black on the g2 to block that idea of connection of these pieces to threat a mate in 1. And after knight g4, Magnus Carlsen here grab now the bishop on b5. And after here, in which actually hammer here plays an inaccurate move after knight b3, that actually open up some lines for his bishop. But after knight b3, it just allow here for Magnus Carlsen to play knight e2 check. And going back, for example, after knight b3 here, hammer he can play his started move with a4 to attack the queen, for example, so that it actually show away this queen to control this diagonal, because there is actually knight to e2. But for example, if the black insists here with knight to e2 check, and after king h1, queen to d3 to maintain the defense, but there's just a simple rook to e1 with two attackers with only one defender. For example, after knight takes c1 and queen takes c1, although the black here has a pair of bishop, but the game must go on with equality with two knights versus these two bishop on the board. So for example, after knight to e2, Magnus Carlsen here to give a check, and hammer was actually forced to move his king to h1. Magnus Carlsen here double now the g file after bishop takes g4, because after h takes g4, it allows him for Magnus Carlsen to have a rapid development after rook to a1 controlling the open e file. And after here again, hammer here play an inaccurate move after bishop to e3, leaving his pawn here undefended against this rook. But for example, after rook to a8, still the black here can play the move a4 on this position and attack the queen here, for example on b5 with his pawn, and he cannot actually leave this diagonal because he will lose his defense against his knight on e2. But for example, after a4, if the black here maintain a defense to his knight with queen to c4, but there's just a simple knight to d2. And after, for example, queen to a6, still there is rook to e1, and even though the knight takes and rook takes c1 on this position, still it is drawish with a minor pieces of knight versus the bishop. So going back after bishop to a3, that allows here for the black to have a +8 on this position, because the black here can actually grab that undefended pawn on e4 with attacking chances. And here after hammer plays rook to e1, but there is a stunning move for the black here, in which a young tricky Magnus Carlsen tries to sacrifice his queen to give a check, because on this position g takes h5 here doesn't work, because there is a mate in 1 on h4, because the knight here controls the g3 and g1 on this position. So there is rook to h4 mate after g takes h5 on this position. So after 17 moves, Magnus Carlsen here wins through resignation, because hammer here didn't continue the game and resign after 17 moves. So going back after knight f3, Arete opening, and actually transpose, for example, on this position after knight bd2 g6 e4, into a sort of perk defense. But for example, after bishop g7, bishop d3, castle, castle, knight c6, in which the black here didn't play c5, so go back into a pure perk defense. And after, for example, c3 for white, e5, h3, a sort of passive move that actually stopped any knight to g4 hop or bishop to g4 and pin the knight. But after h3, it just allow for Magnus Carlsen here to play another style of opening. For example, after knight h5, which it tends to go back into King's Indian opening with f5, f4, for example, an aggressive opening against on this position. And after, for example, after the white here plays d takes e5, knight f4, and bishop b5 with knight takes e5, and here it seems like for me, after it is recommended to play e4, it reminds me here that the ware opening here actually with a4 first move has actually a useful move in the middle game and allows to defend, for example, on this position with a4. But although after knight takes e5 with queen to g5, and the white here was actually forced to knight g4, and after queen takes b5, in which the bishop is actually undefended without the e4 on this position. But again, on this position, it is recommended here to play a4. It seems like, again, a ware opening can be a useful move later on after a4 because it actually defend the b5. And for example, after a4 here, in which the black here will just go for a line after knight a2, king h1, queen d3, rook e1, knight takes, and queen takes, in which again the position was actually drawish. After queen takes b5 for Magnus Carlsen, and Hammer here just play knight b3 and goes for a forced line after knight e2, check, king h1, bishop takes, pawn takes, rook e1. And again on this position, it is recommended here for white to play a4 to equalize the position and go for this line after queen c4, knight d2, queen a6, rook e1, knight takes, rook takes with equality. But Hammer here just play an inaccurate bishop a3, leaving his pawn to be undefended. And for example, after rook takes, rook e1, queen h5, a stunning move for a tricky young Magnus Carlsen, and force his opponent in just 17 moves to resign. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please don't forget to subscribe.